So I've been playing around with vertical targeting recently, and I have a few things that I want to say. Now, whether to keep vertical targeting on or off is one of those discussions that seems as old as time, and the advice that I've generally seen over the past decade goes something like this. For new players, the blanket advice seems to be to keep it off, and it's good advice because vertical targeting does make aiming more complicated. At some point, though, the narrative seems to flip, where all of a sudden vertical targeting is actually a misunderstood gem that all the pros like to use, and in fact, you are leaving performance on the table if you don't use it yourself. In this video, I want to dig into both sides of the story and discuss some of the more complicated aspects of vertical targeting that for some reason I don't see mentioned very much on the internet. By the end of it, I want you to be able to comprehensively assess whether the benefits of vertical targeting are worth its drawbacks given your own personal preferences. Now, in case you don't know what vertical targeting actually is, here's the short version. Your gun's targeting distance points your guns inward so the bullets overlap at a specific point in front of your plane. This point is called the convergence point. Vertical targeting tilts your guns upward so the bullet drop for all of your guns is 0 at this convergence point. And this accomplishes two things. First, if you have guns with different velocities or different vertical placements on your airframe, it makes it so that they all line up at the convergence point. This can be really handy for maximizing damage in something like the MiG-15, for example, because its cannons have different velocities and its guns are very far below the nose. Second, vertical targeting makes it so that you have to lead less with your nose to line up for a shot, because the guns are already pointing a little bit upward. And this is often what people are referring to when they say vertical targeting gives you a competitive advantage. So, great. Case closed, video over. Vertical targeting on is the way to go. Right? Well, maybe not so fast. You see, pointing the guns upward actually changes things quite a lot more than you might realize. Vertical targeting is really only meant to do one thing, and that is compensate for gravity. But the problem is, depending on what orientation your plane is in, gravity doesn't always point in the same direction. And that means vertical targeting only works as intended when your plane is upright. And when it isn't, it introduces some rather strange side effects. These side effects are most noticeable when you're trying to aim at a target that is directly in front of you and relatively far away, such as in a tail chase or a head-on. If your plane is upright, vertical targeting just means you don't have to compensate quite as much for bullet drop to be on target, which is great. And here's a quick in-game example. If you turn your plane upside down, though, things get a little weird. Now, the guns are tilted in the wrong direction, meaning they're actually shooting more toward the ground than they would if you didn't have vertical targeting on. This results in your bullets going a lot further below the target than they would if you had vertical targeting off. Meaning, if you want to hit your target in this scenario, you're going to have to put your crosshairs quite a bit above it to compensate, way more than you'd have to without vertical targeting. And here's an example of that. This gets even weirder if your plane is only partway rolled over, because now the guns are tilted in a direction that is perpendicular to the horizon. So even if it looks like your crosshair is centered on the target, your guns are going to miss because they're shooting either to the left or the right, depending on which direction you're rolled. To compensate for this, you're going to have to purposefully put your crosshair to the side of the target that is opposite the side your cockpit is facing, which feels like you're trying to lead your target even though the target isn't moving in the direction that you're trying to lead. And this is honestly just extremely counterintuitive and very confusing. Also, you got to keep in mind in this scenario that you still have to compensate for bullet drop, and now you're compensating as if you didn't have vertical targeting on because the tilt of your guns isn't helping or hindering you. And here's my best attempt at an in-game example. Now, all of this is just a geometric consequence of vertical targeting, because remember, it makes it so that your guns are now no longer aligned with your plane's center of rotation. Visualized another way, with vertical targeting on, your bullets will draw out this donut shape instead of staying centered on your crosshair if you roll while continuously firing, like this. With all of this in mind, it's maybe not so strange to realize that properly compensating for vertical targeting while continuously rolling looks like drawing this donut in the opposite direction above your target. As you can imagine, this weirdness translates to dogfighting as well. In the worst case scenario, with the guns tilted off center like this, it can result in you completely missing your opponent because you adjusted your roll angle by accident while trying to line up a shot. This also results in the counterintuitive situation where if your target is closer than your convergence distance, you may actually need to aim slightly below it to prevent your bullets from arcing over top. In extreme cases, this can make you miss point-blank shots, and I certainly have. In contrast, with vertical targeting off, where you put the crosshairs is exactly the same no matter what orientation your plane is in. It's really that simple. But, okay, all of this is just a skill issue, and I hear you. With practice, you can learn to compensate for all of this. But that assumes the benefits are actually worth the effort in the first place. Now, right out the gate, one benefit of vertical targeting that I do think can be worth the downsides is if you have an airframe with different cannons with different muzzle velocities. In these planes, the improved bullet bunching that vertical targeting gives you can genuinely feel like a massive buff to damage. Here's a quick explanation of that. We'll use the J2M3 as our example because it has two different 20mm cannons with different muzzle velocities. Not really sure why they did that because it's really annoying to aim, but anyway, we already discussed in the intro how vertical targeting keeps the ballistic arcs closer together within your convergence distance when your plane is upright. Now, the interesting thing is, this effect is still helpful when your plane is rolled over because the lower velocity cannons will be tilted more. This does mean that your cannon trajectories will diverge when gravity isn't keeping them together, but that can still be to your advantage in a deflection shot. So let's take gravity out of the equation. So imagine that you're rolled perpendicular to the horizon. Without vertical targeting, the rounds from both cannon types will go exactly in the same direction. Unfortunately though, your target isn't stationary. So if you lead for the high velocity guns, the low velocity guns will miss because the opponent won't be there anymore by the time those shells arrive. If you lead for the low velocity guns, the high velocity guns will miss because they'll get there before the opponent does. So now let's turn vertical targeting on. Now the low velocity guns will have more tilt than the high velocity guns, meaning it's possible for the same lead to result in both sets of guns hitting your target, because the slow shells get more lead than the fast shells. Now in practice, this still won't be enough to hit both shell types if the target is moving fast, but it does at least help. However, this bullet bunching effect is not the main benefit that I hear people talking about when it comes to vertical targeting. What people talk about much more often is how vertical targeting gives you more lead, which naturally begs the question, how much extra lead can vertical targeting actually give you? To answer that, I wrote a ballistic simulation in Python, specifically for the German Mk108 30mm mine shell. Now I picked this round because it has a notoriously slow muzzle velocity of about 500 meters a second, and also a lot of drag, which means that vertical targeting will have a very exaggerated effect. On the off chance that you're also a nerd like me and you want to know the simulation details, here's a quick slideshow explaining everything. If you have more questions, please let me know, and I'll be happy to answer in the comments. In any case, here are the results. So if we set the convergence to 800 meters, which is as far as you can go in the game, the guns must be pointed up about 1.5 degrees to compensate for bullet drop. That is not insignificant. If we translate this to a horizontal deflection shot that is perpendicular to the horizon, meaning gravity is no longer curving the trajectory, that is a whole 12 meters of extra lead when your target is at 500 meters, and over 19 meters of extra lead at 800 meters. And this can definitely be the difference between a hit or a miss. Now, having this much vertical targeting is a bit ridiculous, and the drawbacks are equally large. With this much tilt, the arc of your bullets goes almost 6 meters above your crosshair at its highest point, which makes aiming at close range extremely annoying. And at this point, it honestly feels like we're reinventing Schlagermusik from first principles. If we go with a more reasonable convergence setting of 500 meters, the maximum height of the bullet trajectory does slim down to just under 2 meters, while still keeping about 6 meters of extra lead in a horizontal deflection shot at 500 meters. Certainly not too shabby. Note as well that the effect of vertical targeting will be much more subtle for guns with higher velocity, because they won't need to be tilted as much to compensate for bullet drop. As a counterexample, here's the 20mm M61 Vulcan, which has less drag and a muzzle velocity of over 1,000 meters per second. As you can see, vertical targeting barely even makes a difference here. Unfortunately, this means that the amount of tilt you get out of vertical targeting is different from gun to gun, even with the same convergence settings, which just adds yet another layer to the learning curve. But, okay. With all of that being said, there's certainly no denying that there can be a substantial boost to your gun's effective lead when you use vertical targeting. However, even this is not strictly an advantage. Let me explain. A boost to lead in one direction requires a reduction to lead in the opposite direction. It's not rocket science, but this does have some serious consequences. So if you were having trouble hitting negative G shots with vertical targeting off, you might as well just forget about it with vertical targeting on, because now you're going to have to lead twice as much to hit your target when your target is under your nose. Also, like I mentioned before, because vertical targeting points the guns away from your center of rotation, trying to hit targets while doing any kind of rolling maneuver becomes very difficult. So in my opinion, this means that vertical targeting drastically decreases your effectiveness in a head-on, because you're essentially forced to keep your plane upright while you're aiming just to stay accurate. And that means you can't start rolling out of the way until after you're completely finished shooting. In fact, I would go so far as to say that vertical targeting makes your aiming more awkward in almost every situation, except of course for your standard bread and butter shot where you've positioned your target directly above the nose. If you're in that specific scenario, vertical targeting does indeed give you an advantage. Now, practically speaking, the majority of your shots will probably be with the target above your nose, so I do understand the players who swear by vertical targeting. However, I would ask this. What kind of behavior does this incentivize? You're buffing the most common move in your arsenal, but in return, you have to take a nerf to all of your other moves. You're not going to be taking those high-angle deflection shots, or those negative G shots, or those tricky head-ons where you have to go upside down or sideways. Instead, you're going to play it by the book. You're going to try to line up every target into that sweet spot directly above your nose so you can make the most of that hard-earned advantage. In short, vertical targeting makes you predictable, and in my book, that is a disadvantage in and of itself. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, honestly, at the end of the day, I still haven't made up my mind about vertical targeting for myself, so I'm going to keep playing around with it, and if you're looking to shake things up, maybe you should too. If you're somebody who swears by vertical targeting, please let me know in the comments if you agree with my takes, or of course if there's anything important that I've missed. On the other hand, if you're a newer player who's just here for advice, here's my 2 cents. You should probably only use vertical targeting on planes whose guns are so annoying to aim to begin with that the benefits of vertical targeting outweigh its many drawbacks. So stuff like the J2M3 or the ME262, maybe the MiG-15, but I'm personally still on the fence about that one. Otherwise, just keep it simple. Keep vertical targeting off. You can find that extra degree of lead elsewhere. I believe in you. And with that, I'll leave you with this nice little dogfight that I got in my J2M3 while I was messing around with my vertical targeting settings. Till next time.